My son's DNA test for school said he's not genetically related to me. But I gave birth to him myself. I watched him being born. The truth, when I finally found out, cut me to the bones. Thanks for choosing to watch my video. Feel free to leave a comment on the story and subscribe to the channel. The email from Mrs. Patterson came through at 2:47 on a Wednesday afternoon, right when I was elbow deep in a spreadsheet that made me want to fake my own death and start a new life selling seashells on a beach somewhere. The subject line read, "Regarding Devin's science project, please call," and I figured he'd probably mixed up baking soda and something explosive again, which would be typical for my 12-year-old who approached science with the enthusiasm of someone defusing bombs for fun. I called the school from my car during my break, sitting in the parking lot of the insurance company where I'd worked for 8 years processing claims and slowly losing my will to live one form at a time. Mrs. Patterson picked up on the second ring, and her voice had that careful quality people use when they're about to tell you something that's going to ruin your whole month. "Mrs. Williams, thank you for calling back so quickly. I need to discuss Devin's genetics project with you, and I think it would be better if we could meet in person, perhaps with your husband as well." My stomach did this uncomfortable flip because teachers don't ask for in-person meetings with both parents unless someone's either failing catastrophically or committed a felony on school grounds. Is Devin in trouble? Did he break something? Please tell me he didn't break something expensive. No, nothing like that. He's not in trouble at all. It's about the results of his DNA analysis, and I think there may have been some kind of error with the testing kit, but I'd rather explain this face to face. We scheduled the meeting for the next day after school, and I spent the rest of my shift trying not to spiral into anxiety while my coworker Shanice kept asking me what was wrong, until I finally told her just to get her to stop hovering. "Girl, it's probably nothing," she said, applying lipstick without a mirror because she had that kind of confidence. "These home DNA kits are janky anyway. My cousin did one, and it said she was 30% Scandinavian when her entire family tree is from Louisiana going back 200 years. I picked up my husband Trevor from his barbershop at 5, and he climbed into the car smelling like aftershave and that bergamot oil he used on his clippers, his locks tied back with the blue band I'd bought him for his birthday. What's this about a meeting? Devin finally blow something up? I don't know, Mrs. Patterson was being weird about it, said something about his DNA project having errors. Trevor frowned, drumming his fingers on his knee the way he did when he was thinking. What kind of errors? Kids got my cheekbones and your attitude ain't no error there. We met Mrs. Patterson in her classroom the next afternoon, a space covered in periodic tables and posters about famous scientists, most of whom were dead white guys. But at least she'd added some recent ones who actually looked like the kids she taught. Devin was sitting at one of the lab tables looking confused but not worried, which meant he genuinely had no idea what was happening, and that made me feel slightly better. Mrs. Patterson closed the door and sat down across from us, and I noticed she'd brought another teacher with her, Mr. Hughes, who taught biology and had a PhD from somewhere impressive that he mentioned approximately once per conversation. Thank you both for coming in. Mrs. Patterson started, her hands folded on the table like she was about to deliver news about a terminal diagnosis. The 7th grade is doing a genetics unit, and part of the project involves students using DNA testing kits to learn about inheritance patterns and genetic markers. It's an optional component, but Devin chose to participate. Okay, I said slowly, waiting for the other shoe to drop and hoping it wasn't a shoe that would require therapy or legal intervention. Mr. Hughes cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses in that way that people do when they're uncomfortable. The kits we use are educational versions, not as comprehensive as commercial ancestry tests, but they do provide reliable data about basic genetic relationships. Devin's results came back showing some unexpected findings, and we've double-checked them with the lab to make sure there wasn't a processing error. What kind of unexpected findings? Trevor's voice had gone tight, and I felt his hand find mine under the table. The results indicate that Devin shares significant genetic markers with you, Mr. Williams, consistent with a biological father-son relationship. However, the markers we'd expect to see from Mrs. Williams are absent. The test suggests no genetic relationship between Devin and his mother. The words landed like somebody had thrown a brick through the window of my understanding of reality. I heard myself laugh, this sharp barking sound that didn't match anything I was feeling. That's impossible. I gave birth to him. I was there. I did the whole 9 months and the 22 hours of labor and the epidural that barely worked. You can't give birth to a child and not be genetically related to them. Actually, Mr. Hughes said in his professor voice that I immediately hated. There are rare cases involving chimerism or conditions where I don't have chimerism or whatever fancy condition you're about to describe, I interrupted, my voice rising despite my intention to stay calm. I know my own child came out of my own body. I have the stretch marks and the C-section scar to prove it. Mrs. Patterson raised her hands in a calming gesture. We're not suggesting anything about your relationship with Devin, and we certainly don't doubt that you're his mother in every way that matters. We're simply letting you know that the test results are showing something unusual, and you may want to follow up with your own testing to understand why. Devin, who'd been silent this whole time, finally spoke up. So I'm not actually related to Mom? Like, biologically? His voice cracked on the last word, and I saw his eyes getting shiny, and that broke something loose in my chest. Baby, you are absolutely my son. This test is wrong. These kits make mistakes all the time. But even as I said it, my mind was racing backward through time, landing on the memory I'd tried not to think about too much over the years. The fertility treatments, the IVF, the 3 years of trying naturally before we'd finally admitted we needed help. Trevor and I drove home in silence, Devin sitting in the back seat with his headphones on, probably listening to that rap music he thought we didn't know was full of curse words. My husband's jaw was set in that way that meant he was processing something big, working through it systematically like he did everything, while I felt like my thoughts were birds flying in 100 different directions. At home, after Devin had gone upstairs to his room, Trevor and I sat at the kitchen table with the paperwork from the fertility clinic we'd used 12 years ago, documents I'd kept in a file box in the basement because some part of me had always known we might need them someday. The clinic had been called New Horizons Fertility Center, located in downtown Atlanta in one of those medical buildings that tries too hard to look comforting with its earth tones and abstract art that's supposed to be soothing but just looks like someone spilled paint on a canvas and called it a day. Dr. Ramesh Singh had been our reproductive endocrinologist, a man with kind eyes and steady hands who'd walked us through every step of the IVF process like it was the most natural thing in the world. I remembered the egg retrieval, the anesthesia, waking up groggy while a nurse told me they'd harvested 14 eggs, which was a good number, which gave us a strong chance. I remembered Trevor providing his sample in a room that tried to pretend it wasn't specifically designed for that purpose, with magazines nobody wanted to discuss and a lock that probably saw more action than a bank vault. I remembered the call 3 days later telling us that 6 embryos had successfully developed to the blastocyst stage, and the decision to implant 2 of them, hoping at least one would take. We signed all these consent forms, I said, flipping through pages of legal documents that I'd barely read at the time because I'd been so desperate to have a baby that I would have signed away my car if it meant getting pregnant. There's stuff here about genetic testing, about using our own genetic material, about what happens to unused embryos. Trevor was on his laptop, his reading glasses perched on his nose, searching for information about IVF mistakes and lab errors. Yo, Simone, look at this. There's cases where clinics have mixed up genetic material, used the wrong sperm or the wrong eggs, implanted embryos in the wrong patients. There was a case in 2019 where a couple in California gave birth to twins that weren't genetically related to either of them because the clinic implanted the wrong embryos entirely. I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. You think that's what happened? They used someone else's eggs instead of mine? I don't know what to think. But we need to find out. We need to get proper testing done, not some school project kit, and we need to contact that clinic. The next morning, I called New Horizons Fertility Center, only to be told by a perky receptionist that Dr. Singh had retired 3 years ago, and the clinic had been sold to a larger medical group that now operated under a different name. She transferred me to their patient records department, where a woman named Michelle informed me that while they maintained records from the previous ownership, I'd need to submit a formal request in writing and wait 6 to 8 weeks for processing. 6 to 8 weeks? My son just found out he might not be genetically related to me. I need answers now, not in 2 months. Michelle's voice went from professional to robotic. I understand your concern, Mrs. Williams, but we have protocols for releasing medical records, and I'm not authorized to expedite requests without proper documentation and approval from our legal department. I hung up and immediately called Trevor, who was between clients at the shop. They're stonewalling me, talking about protocols and legal departments like I'm asking for state secrets instead of information about my own medical treatment. We need a lawyer, he said simply. This is bigger than us trying to figure it out on our own. If the clinic messed up, if they used the wrong eggs, that's malpractice, that's a lawsuit, they better have good insurance because we're about to become their worst nightmare. I'd never hired a lawyer for anything more serious than reviewing our mortgage documents, but Shanice's sister Yvette was a paralegal at a firm that handled medical malpractice cases, and she got me a consultation with one of their attorneys for that same afternoon. The lawyer's name was Barbara Chen, a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense haircut and the kind of sharp eyes that probably saw through every lie anyone ever tried to tell her. Her office was in Midtown, decorated with diplomas from impressive schools and photos of her with people who looked important. I explained everything while she took notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen moving in quick, efficient strokes. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me for a moment. First thing we need to do is get definitive testing done, not through a school project, but through a certified laboratory that can provide results that will hold up legally. I'm going to refer you to a facility we work with regularly. Second, I'm going to file a formal request for your medical records from New Horizons, and when they give me the 6 to 8 weeks nonsense, I'm going to explain that they have 72 hours to comply, or we're going to start discovery proceedings. Discovery? It means we're suing them, and they'll be required to produce documents whether they want to or not. But I suspect once they receive a letter from an attorney, they'll suddenly find a way to expedite that request. The testing facility she sent us to was in Buckhead, and Trevor and I went together that evening, along with Devin, who seemed to be handling all of this with the resilience of someone who'd inherited at least some of my ability to compartmentalize trauma into a box and deal with it later. A phlebotomist drew blood from all 3 of us, labeling each vial with meticulous care, and told us results would be available in 5 to 7 business days. Those days stretched out like years, and I kept looking at Devin, trying to see what I'd always seen: Trevor's cheekbones and jawline, my eyes and my stubborn streak, this perfect combination of both of us that made him undeniably ours. Except maybe he wasn't mine. Not genetically, not in the way I'd always assumed. The thought made me want to throw up every time it crossed my mind. The results came back on a Tuesday via encrypted email, and Barbara called us into her office to review them together. She spread the documents across her desk, technical language about genetic markers and probability percentages, and conclusions that read like someone had reached into my chest and rearranged my organs. The test confirms that Devin is biologically related to Trevor, with a probability of 99.99%, Barbara said, her finger tracing down the page. However, the test shows no genetic relationship between Devin and Simone. Based on these findings and the circumstances of Devin's conception via IVF, the most likely explanation is that the fertility clinic used donor eggs instead of Simone's eggs, either through negligence or a systematic error in their laboratory protocols. Barbara filed the formal request for medical records on a Friday, and by Monday morning her office received a call from New Horizons legal counsel, a man named Jeffrey Hartman, who apparently specialized in making problems disappear before they became lawsuits. Barbara put him on speakerphone while Trevor and I sat in her office, and his voice came through smooth and unconcerned, like he dealt with this kind of thing every day before breakfast. Ms. Chen, I've reviewed your client's request, and we're certainly willing to provide the relevant medical records. However, I'd like to propose that we handle this matter informally before anyone starts throwing around accusations that could be damaging to all parties involved. Barbara's expression didn't change, but I saw her grip her pen a little tighter. Mr. Hartman, my clients aren't interested in informal discussions. They're interested in understanding how a fertility clinic used the wrong genetic material during their IVF procedure 12 years ago, and what exactly happened in your laboratory that led to this error. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that meant someone was recalculating their approach. I'm not acknowledging that any error occurred, Ms. Chen. What I'm saying is that fertility procedures are complex, and sometimes outcomes don't match initial expectations for a variety of scientific reasons that aren't necessarily indicative of malpractice. Then you won't mind producing the complete chain of custody documentation for my client's eggs, the laboratory logs from the retrieval and fertilization process, and the quality control records from the embryo transfer procedure. Another pause, longer this time. That information is protected under various privacy regulations and internal quality assurance protocols. We can't simply hand over sensitive laboratory documentation without proper legal authority. Then I'll see you in court, Mr. Hartman, because we're filing a lawsuit this afternoon, and during discovery you'll be required to produce every single document I just mentioned, along with depositions from every staff member who was working at New Horizons in 2013, and probably a forensic audit of your entire laboratory operation during that time period. Your choice. Cooperate now or cooperate later after this becomes public record, and every news outlet in Atlanta finds out that New Horizons Fertility Center can't keep track of whose eggs belong to whom. I heard papers rustling on his end. Give me 48 hours to consult with my client and review the relevant files. I'll call you back Wednesday morning. Barbara hung up and looked at us with something like satisfaction. He's scared, which means they know something's wrong. Clinics don't lawyer up this fast unless they've already found the problem in their records. So what do we do now? I asked, feeling exhausted by the whole process, by the waiting and the legal maneuvering and the way everyone talked around the central fact that somewhere in a laboratory 12 years ago, someone had taken the wrong eggs and put them inside me and never bothered to check if they'd just destroyed my entire understanding of motherhood. Now we wait for Wednesday, and if Hartman doesn't come back with answers and a settlement offer, we file the lawsuit and make this whole thing very public and very expensive for them. Hartman called back on Wednesday at 9 a.m, and this time his voice had lost its smooth edges. Ms. Chen, I reviewed the laboratory records from 2013, and I need to have a conversation with you and your clients about some concerning findings. Would it be possible to meet in person this week? We met on Friday in a conference room at Barbara's firm, a space designed to intimidate with its floor-to-ceiling windows and table that could seat 20 people but currently held just the 6 of us. Barbara and her associate, Trevor, and me, Hartman and another lawyer from the clinic's insurance company named Patricia Okoye, who looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else. Hartman opened a leather folder and pulled out documents that he handled like they might explode if he held them wrong. On May 3, 2013, Simone Williams underwent egg retrieval at New Horizons Fertility Center. The procedure resulted in 14 viable eggs, which were properly labeled and stored according to our protocols. However, on May 6, when those eggs were scheduled to be fertilized, there appears to have been a labeling error in the laboratory. He slid a photocopied page across the table, showing what looked like a laboratory log with handwritten notes and codes I didn't understand. The technician who performed the fertilization procedure, a woman named Rebecca Ashford, who no longer works for the clinic, appears to have confused 2 patients, samples that were being processed during the same time window. Instead of using Mrs. Williams' eggs, she used eggs belonging to another patient, a donor who was providing eggs for a different couple's IVF cycle. The words hit me like a physical force, and I heard Trevor's sharp intake of breath beside me. You're telling me that for 12 years, my son has been genetically related to some random egg donor and nobody at your clinic caught this mistake? The error was compounded by the fact that Mrs. Williams' cycle resulted in a successful pregnancy on the first transfer attempt. Hartman continued, his voice taking on this rehearsed quality like he was reading from a script his PR team had prepared. Since the pregnancy proceeded normally and resulted in the birth of a healthy child, there was no reason for anyone to question the genetic relationship until now. Barbara's voice cut through the room like a blade. What happened to Simone's actual eggs? Hartman and Okoye exchanged a look that told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. They were fertilized using donor sperm meant for another couple and implanted in a different patient, who also became pregnant and delivered a child in early 2014. The room started spinning, and I gripped the edge of the table to keep myself anchored to reality. So somewhere out there, some other woman has my biological child and I have hers, and your clinic just let this happen and never said anything for over a decade? The clinic didn't know about the error until we pulled these records this week, Okoye said, finally speaking up in a voice that suggested she was deeply regretting her career choices. The labeling system we used in 2013 has since been replaced with a more robust tracking protocol precisely to prevent this kind of mistake, and the technician responsible was let go in 2015 for unrelated performance issues. Trevor stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Unrelated performance issues? Y'all fired somebody who couldn't keep track of whose eggs were whose for performance issues? Like she was just bad at filing paperwork? This woman switched our entire genetic future, and you gave her a pink slip and called it a day? Mr. Williams, I understand you're upset. Upset doesn't even begin to cover what I am right now. You need to come with a better word than upset. Barbara raised her hand, her expression deadly calm. Let's talk numbers, Mr. Hartman, because my clients are going to file a lawsuit for medical malpractice, negligence, fraud, emotional distress, and probably a few other things I'll think of before we submit the paperwork. New Horizons is going to pay for this mistake in ways that will make your insurance company weep, and then we're going to make sure every person who's ever used your clinic knows exactly how careless you were with the most important decision of their lives. So before we go down that road, tell me what kind of settlement you're prepared to offer. Hartman opened another folder, and I could see his hands shaking slightly. We're authorized to offer $850,000 in exchange for a confidentiality agreement and a full release of liability. Multiply that by 10 and remove the confidentiality requirement, and we'll think about it, Barbara said without missing a beat. This story needs to be public because there are other families out there who used your clinic, who deserve to know that New Horizons can't be trusted with their genetic material, who need to understand that every child born from your laboratory in 2013 might not be who they think they are. I looked at Trevor, whose face had gone hard in a way I'd only seen a few times in our marriage, during moments when someone had disrespected him or threatened something he loved. He nodded once, and I turned back to Hartman and Okoye. We're not taking your money and pretending this didn't happen. We're burning your reputation to the ground and making sure every fertility clinic in America knows exactly what happens when you treat people's babies like they're interchangeable lab samples. See you in court. We walked out of that conference room with Barbara already on her phone with her firm's litigation department, and I felt something shift inside me. This weird combination of rage and grief and determination that made my hands shake as I reached for Trevor's arm. Our lawsuit went public 2 weeks later, and the story hit the news like a bomb going off, every major outlet picking it up, other families coming forward with concerns about New Horizons, a state investigation being launched into the clinic's laboratory practices. The numbers kept getting bigger as Barbara's team discovered more evidence of negligence and a pattern of inadequate quality control that went back years before Devin was born, and now we're looking at a multi-million-dollar settlement that might actually force the clinic to close entirely, which feels like the least they deserve for taking my genetic legacy and handing it to a stranger while giving me someone else's child and expecting me to never notice. And somewhere out there is another mother who gave birth to my biological daughter and has no idea that the universe got scrambled in a laboratory in Atlanta 12 years ago, and eventually will have to figure out what to do about that truth.